my colleagues, Catherine Stratos, who is the head of our program team in the Climate Change Office. We call it a division now, don't we? And Becky Nicodemus, she seems to do everything, but she is in particular working on this and on M&E for adaptation. And I'm going to turn it over to them. Catherine?
So thank you for staying. What we have in mind today is in some ways very consistent with the rest of this morning. We'll talk a lot about frameworks and tools, so you'll feel right at home based on Heather's comments. But it'll be a little bit different in that it'll be hands-on. We have I'm not even sure if it's a beta version of this tool, but what we'd like to do is have you use it, clustering together, if possible, with other people from your organization and applying it to your organization because we figure that's the organization you know best. So that's what we would like to try to do today. I think it might be fun. And we are hoping to capitalize, obviously, on your experience and insights to help us road test it. Becky, which button do I push? Yep, Becky does do everything. Okay, so just really quick, some other context setting. AID has a climate change and development strategy since 2012. It has 3 primary objectives: mitigation, adaptation, and integration of climate change considerations into the agency's broader portfolio and policies. We are spread out very widely also in terms of countries, working in more than 40 countries. We have a results framework. This just illustrates the 3 objectives, including the integration one that's a little bit different. And within each of those objectives, there is really a focus on building the capacity of institutions and organizations to deal with climate change, either to be aware of the risks of climate change, the vulnerabilities of their programs and their mission to climate change, or to reduce climate change emissions. So again, just as way of illustrating the central role that capacity building of organizations plays in our theory of change, here are these results frameworks for 3 of the areas that we work in. And also, by way of illustration, we went through the mission's annual performance reports and just pulled out the names of some of the organizations that our missions work with on climate change. And again, this is very consistent with what was mentioned earlier today. These aren't climate change organizations per se. These are organizations dealing with climate change and figuring out how to integrate climate change into their broader mandate. So this brings us to the need to measure if we are having an impact in this area of our work. And here too, I will build off what my colleague Monica spoke about earlier this morning about the skepticism of pilots. Equally, there's often a skepticism about capacity building to what end, for what results. How can you tell you're making a difference? So we get a lot of hard questions when it comes to engaging in this area of work, and we feel we need to have a better response than we do currently. So we see maybe measuring, capturing institutional changes in capacity, assessing institutional, I don't know if measuring is always the right word, but we are attempting that, both from a performance monitoring perspective, so that we know if we are having results so that we can be accountable, as well as needing a tool from an evaluation perspective. If we want to document that different changes took place, how do we do that, right? We need a systematic way to capture where an organization is at the beginning of a project and at the end. So for both of those functions, having a tool is really critical. So we have been going, and these, let me just say briefly, we have, for instance, a standard performance indicator that we encourage our missions to use that is simply the number of institutions with improved capacity to address climate change issues. Well, for us at an agency level, that's really just a yes, no, and that's not so useful. Why we push this indicator is because we would like our missions to focus on a few key institutions and really pay attention to whether those institutions are changing and are getting more capable in this area. And again, therefore, we want a tool that helps them track progress, that helps them see where is there change, where is there not change, what have we perhaps missed. Maybe there are deficiencies that we need to help our partners address. So again, we have been shopping. We've been looking for a tool. We didn't think we'd have to create one ourselves. We looked both in the kind of organizational development sphere because there are a lot of tools in development work that assess how an organization is building its capacity in a general sense. And we also looked at some of the more climate change adaptation specific tools to see if there's anything that met our needs. There's some really great tools out there. A lot of them we felt, however, were not general enough, I would say, or we felt like we needed something that was rooted more on the organizational development side rather than on the climate change side. So to build on those structures. So after looking about, we actually wound up staying close to home and settling on a new tool that other USAID colleagues have developed, the Organizational Capacity Assessment Tool. I will say, right from the beginning, my colleague Eric Hyman is here. He was one of the people instrumental in the development of the OCA tool. It serves a different purpose. For us, it was convenient because it's provided us with a structure for our much more specialized itty-bitty tool. But what they have is something that really is for purposes of organizational development. It's meant to be used by the local organizations that are receiving funding from AID, because AID has put an emphasis on direct funding of local organizations as part of USAID Forward. And as part of that process, AID is encouraging those organizations to continue to develop and become more capable. So the emphasis with the OCA tool is on self-assessment. I believe there's also flexibility in having organizations tailor the tool for their needs, right, Eric? Because it's for them, right? It's a tool for them. We have piggybacked on some of the structure of the tool, but we really have a different purpose in mind. We envision this tool being used by our USAID colleagues, implementing partners, or third-party consultants to assess really the degree of integration of climate change into the structure and fabric of the organizations that are receiving technical assistance from AID climate change projects. And at this point, we don't envision encouraging the users of the tool to make changes to it. We think it probably needs to stay consistent, but because we want to look at change over years in particular, but we can, that's something maybe we want to explore in our discussion. So just briefly, I'm going to give you a little intro to the tool, which you will be getting your own copy of soon. And we've split it up into governance, information, data, and analysis because of the really key role that climate information plays in helping organizations deal with climate change. Planning, resources, and then we bunched implementation, monitoring, and evaluation together. Wouldn't mind getting feedback on that. So each section has its own measures and its own set of questions. I just found grammatical mistakes, of course, in this one, so I apologize. But it's things such as, is the climate change mandate or mission widely known and accepted by the relevant stakeholders as kind of an example of basic capacity? Is there a formally or informally articulated mandate or mission to address climate change? Is it specific and clear enough? Maybe there is one, but it's rather vague. Maybe it is somewhat contradictory with the overall mission of the organization. So we try to tease out some of those aspects of governance and mission. And then we have some illustrative questions to get the ball rolling. And just to highlight, like an example would be, is the climate change mandate policy known and accepted by most of the relevant staff? Is the mandate externally imposed? Is it internally resisted? Just to kind of get you talking and finding out just where is this organization in this continuum. And just for FYI, we have score sheets which we've shamelessly stolen from the more general OCA tool. But I don't think we're going to get this far today, but we've developed those. So let's test it out. What we would like to ask you to do is to get in groups of 4 or 5, clustering. I mean, we're the last event of the day, right? So we can rearrange chairs. Ooh, so let's make maybe some circles. And what I would encourage you to do, if you see someone else from your organization, sit together with 2 or 3 other people from your organization if you can, and have someone else interview you using the tool. And what we've done is we've put little stickies in about 20 copies of this tool, and they start at different sections. So that way we'll have different groups trying out different sections, so we get feedback on the questions and the whatever you call it, for each section or each aspect of the organization. So, are you game? Will you play with us? Yeah, that would be really great. I think it'll be a great way to get a lot of feedback very quickly on this tool. And I know our missions would be very grateful to you to help us finish this because they've been asking for this for a while. Okay, so what I would suggest is if you would just stand up and look at whoever else is in the room and find each other. And I know these symposiums and conferences are nice for talking to other people, but for this purpose, we need some clustering. And then we need a designated interviewer, and if someone really is feeling more passive today, they can be a note taker, okay? Okay. And we need to hand out the questionnaire to the groups. So once you're in a group, then we'll give you the questionnaire. Okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're going to do things a little bit differently today. You don't have to spend as much time listening to me. I will just say thanks for coming. I'll remind everyone, if you would like to or be willing to sign up for the Climate Links web portal that we're going to be that AID is going to be launching over the next few weeks, month. Please talk to the folks at registration. We just have a little checkbox on the registration form. We'll send out an email with a password, and that over time will become a repository for all of the information that this program, the broader adaptation program, and then the mitigation and sustainable landscapes programs across the agency are developing. We're very hopeful it'll be easier to find things there than it is on the broader USAID webpage. If you're enjoying a coffee or some sort of breakfast, thank the Agility team, Deborah, particularly Jamie, Mike Cody, Lily, Mukul, Skylar. They've done a great job all week at getting everything together and prepping me and all of that. So thank you to you guys. Thanks to the Carnegie Endowment for hosting us today and tomorrow. We're in the same place for 2 days, so less trekking around town. And with that, I will turn it over to Glenn Anderson. Glenn has been the chief of party on the CCRD project for almost 4 years. I've worked with him for 2 or 3 years before that. Or five. It's been fun. He's become my voice of reminders. Yesterday, Glenn was helping me try to remember the answers to questions. And Glenn is going to introduce our panelists and our moderator for the session. Glenn?
Okay, thank you, John, and welcome everybody. Day 3 of 4 days. This is what we call an urban day. It will feature a lot of CCRD work, but it's not our intention just to showcase CCRD work, and I'll talk a little bit about that. As the people in this room know, climate change is a significant and increasing concern, exacerbated by demographic shifts from rural to urban areas, and an increased concentration of populations on the coast, so that urban areas are subject to all of those short-term extreme events, which the Philippines would like to forget completely, as well as emerging issues dealing with sea level rise, and we don't really know what's going to happen to extreme events over time. Following the Adaptation Partnership Workshop in Bangkok in July 2012, which mostly featured urban adaptation work in Asia, particularly the work that was being done under ACERN. CCRD developed what we call our Climate Resilient Infrastructure Services Program. And the emphasis is on services, not so much on the infrastructure, but the services that infrastructure provides to cities. And today you'll hear about the CRIS program, and you'll also hear about work that the Urban Institute has been doing and Mass Design Group. We'll have some discussion of that. And one thing I will say is that the session doesn't really do justice to the global work that's going on in urban areas. But we hope that the presentations and the discussion of the presentations will help us identify good practices, actionable gaps that need to be addressed, and new directions for USAID and other donors to consider in their adaptation programming. I also want to introduce Chaz Cadwell, who is the director of the Urban Institute's Center for International Development and Governance, and he'll serve as the moderator for Urban Day. If you have a program, he has a rather impressive bio, which is about twice as long as mine, I noticed, but has done quite a bit. And I'm meeting Chaz for the first time, but it's very interesting that he's a lawyer by training, and he's done a lot of economics work, and I'm an economist by training, and I minored in law. So this is the first time I've had the opportunity in this program to introduce a fellow bottom feeder. So, So, you know, we're comfortable with that. But between us, we probably know all the economics and law jokes that have been, lawyer jokes that have been, are out there in the world. Also, I'd like to introduce Heather McGray. She's the Director of Vulnerability and Adaptation at the World Resource Institute. That's Heather, and she will serve as the rapporteur for the morning session and provide comments at the conclusion of the morning session just before lunch. Okay, Chaz?
Thank you, Glenn, very much, I think. One reason to have a longer bio is I have more gray hair. Good morning and welcome to Urban Climate Day in this 4-day movable feast of adaptation experience and expertise. Although I guess we're not moving after today. It's appropriate that we have a day targeting urban climate and urban resilience, and I presume most of us are here because we believe this focus is warranted. But it's a pleasure for the Urban Institute to applaud USAID and the CCRD program for the attention you're drawing to the specific challenges facing urban leaders in the developing world. Today we're going to hear from several leaders of this work who've been working with local officials, with NGOs, with the private sector, and other donors to better understand, plan, and implement needed infrastructure improvement and resilience in the face of climate-challenged urban areas. And from your program, you know specifically Peru, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, and then Macedonia. But before we dive into those two panels, a little bit of context. We all know that the challenge urban leaders face is not simply a climate challenge. In most places we work, infrastructure, but also other services, especially for the poor, are not adequate to support human development, employment, political participation, that are all challenged by low levels of institutional development in cities around the developing world, where we now know, of course, that more than half the world's population now lives. These existing gaps are pressured from two large developments outside the control of the urban leaders we work with. One, of course, is climate. That's what we're here to talk about today. But the other is demographics. As dystopian as many cities may seem, every day hundreds of thousands of people vote with their feet and move to urban areas, either for economic opportunity or in many cases to escape conflict. And of course, as climate changes in rural areas, we'll have a new class of refugees as well, again putting pressure on cities. So urban leaders face two closing scissor blades, climate-accelerated stress on their existing systems and the accelerated service burdens from rapidly growing populations. So our panels this morning target some pilot work being done on climate-resilient infrastructure in several places. My colleague Amar Malik from the Urban Institute will share some of our work we're doing to try to take systematic stock of the broad capacity of urban leaders to address these challenges in water, sanitation, and solid waste in a series of African cities. But for all this, we need to think beyond today and beyond today's conference. There's much more that needs to be understood and acted upon by urban leaders and by those of us who purport to be supporting them as they face these challenges. If I can mention a few of the things that we're doing at the Urban Institute that are not as directly related, but we've, following Hurricane Katrina, an urban team brought their decades of experience to produce a series of essays on models and policies to help the rebuilding effort of cities in the Gulf Coast. My colleague at the Urban Institute, Ralph Pendle, chaired a MacArthur Foundation-funded research network on building resilient regions and cities. More recently, Urban's Carlos Martin has led a team that evaluated the post-Hurricane Sandy rebuild by design effort that was with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation in coordination with the HUD's Hurricane Sandy Task Force. In the last weeks, we have launched a new collaboration with the Rockefeller Foundation to help monitor their 100 Resilient Cities initiative, which many of you may be familiar with. And some of you may have attended an event we hosted a couple of weeks ago where Rockefeller's President Judith Rodin and OMB's Director Sean Donovan had a conversation about urban adaptation challenges. Of more direct relevance to today, we had a team last summer systematically review the adaptation plans of 24 countries in the global south, focusing on issues that our own work, our broader work on urban development suggested were important to help cities identify challenges, plan, budget, implement and evaluate the steps they were taking. So we asked a series of questions. Do the national plans address urban service delivery matters directly? Do they reflect awareness of the coordination among levels of government? It's what we think of as vertical governance. How do local governments, regions, and national governments coordinate? Do the plans reflect awareness of the revenue and resource capacity of local leaders? Do they address the emerging issues of distributional equity? In short, do they seem implementable? And I think for all of us, that's the challenge going forward. Suffice it to say that in that review, we found, as the IPCC report predicted, that there's a lot of considerable good work to be done to develop these national plans and to implement them at the local level. There is a lot to be done to figure out how places with weakly enabled systems of local government, no financial discretion, no administrative discretion, and oftentimes little political accountability, how do they implement well thought through adaptation plans in the face of political economy that may favor central governments and or particular parts of a country? So these are all challenges that are key to climate resilience, but of course they're fundamental challenges facing service delivery even without the additional challenge of climate. And that's why the push to mainstream climate thinking into all of USAID's programs is so welcome and important. It's why the President's executive order in October directed all foreign aid programs, not just USAID, to take steps forward in this way. And as the executive order also recognizes, our collective success in addressing these issues depends on mainstreaming climate into the processes of our counterparts in developing countries. And that's a challenge that means we need to understand not just the technical details, but the political details of how our counterparts are doing this. In any event, that's why we're so pleased to join AID and the CCRD team today. As a wider community with shared concerns for urban resilience and adaptation, we have a lot to learn from each other and from our counterparts in the developing world. We have a very tight program this morning. We have and a lot of very good presentations from some smart people. So what we're going to do is have our four panelists make some presentations, and we'll take questions at the end of that time. And then we'll have a short coffee break, and your cooperation with us and making it short will mean that we stay on time so that our second panel can convene promptly on schedule. With that, we're going to go, our presentations are not going to be in alphabetical order, which is the way they appear in the program. We're going to start with Joanne Potter from ICF, then Maria Sofia Dunin-Borkowski, who's, I guess, paired with you on your presentation, Joanne, and Monica Bonsal from USAID, ex-USAID Dominican Republic, I guess, and Sierra Bainbridge from the Mass Design Group. Their full biographies are in your program, but in the interest of moving us quickly today, I'm going to leave it at that and invite Joanne to make her presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very glad to be here to talk with you more through the lens of the city and the city manager in developing countries and how climate resilience affects their work. Chaz did a gorgeous job, I thought, of kind of outlining the challenges that cities face. And I'll just recap that we're talking about cities that are growing extremely rapidly. The populations are just surging because as folks move there for economic opportunity. Because of that, the demands for expanded public services are great. They don't have a lot of money. They really are struggling to keep up with those essential services. And as Chaz mentioned, there's limited authority at the local level in many of these countries. So we're looking at a centralized system with a lot of demand at the local level. A lot of the cities we're working with have weak enforcement, and so even if they have good policies or regulations on the books, it may not make a difference in terms of what actually occurs. And there's limited staff capacity often. So this is a problem for all the activities that local municipalities are trying to achieve. It's particularly urgent and problematic, I think, when you're talking about infrastructure services, because as those populations grow, there's a lot of infrastructure that's being built to provide support. And this infrastructure represents a huge capital investment. It's very expensive. Once it's built, it's going to be there for a long time. And unless it's designed to be resilient under future conditions, it's going to be money that's not appropriately spent or optimally spent. So there's a real urgency here to integrate climate considerations into the expansion and growth of developing cities. We also have a real window of opportunity here because these cities are being developed rapidly. And if we can get it right, and if we can work with them to get it right, we have an opportunity to shape the course of their growth in a more resilient fashion. And so that's the challenge that we all face today. The Climate Resilient Infrastructure Services Program that Glenn mentioned through the CCRD project has been working with a handful of pilot cities around the world to test and develop tools and approaches that work at the local level and then replicate those around the world. And there's a number of staff here today who've been working on these pilots. Could I ask the CRIS team, those of you who are here, to just stand up and take a bow? Charlotte working on Mozambique. We have Vietnam and John and Angela here have been supporting the whole program. So if I get it wrong, check with them. What I'd like to do is provide an overview of what the CRIS approach has been, give you a snapshot of how that's played out in one of the pilot cities in Nacala, Mozambique. Then Maria Sofia will talk about the work we've been doing in Piura, and Monica will talk about Santo Domingo. So the CRIS pilot approach took the CRD framework that I hope you've all memorized by now, become a good friend, and tailored that into a work plan for each of the individual cities because it plays out differently in each city. So the work plans focused on building capacity. Part of that involved pulling in multidisciplinary stakeholders who work with city staff. Part of it was on giving Climate 101 training, just raising awareness about what climate change is. Climate change as opposed to weather, for example. A lot of technical training for city staff. We had a series of small grants that worked with NGO partners with municipalities, and training also on helping cities understand how to articulate what their development objectives are in the context of climate change so they can be more successful for funding. Then there was, from there, we went on developing tools and approaches to actually do vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning and implement resiliency strategies. And finally, sharing lessons learned. A big focus of the program is on integrating climate into core processes so that climate isn't a separate consideration. It's really integrated into the development plans, into the procurement processes, into the ongoing operations and management of programs. Identifying the staff who are responsible for working on climate change and helping them have the technical skills they need to do that accurately, and working on this vertical coordination that Chaz mentioned so that local governments aren't alone in that, and they've identified the players at the regional government, at the national government, that can be good partners with them. And finally, developing an action plan so that when the CRIS program pulled out, the work continues. Now, in Nacalaporto, Mozambique, it's a wonderful city, northern coast of Mozambique, deep water port, subject to severe storms and cyclones. And so their problems around climate change are largely around erosion, precipitation, and sedimentation. They are growing very rapidly. After the Civil War ended about 20 years ago, there's been an influx of foreign investment. And the city hasn't really, is struggling to shape their development. So supporting the urban development master plan in that city, dealing with erosion and improving services to support that burgeoning population. So we worked on, the Mozambique team worked with city staff to identify the local partners that they can work with and really engage them as full partners in climate resilience, training on the CRD framework and basic principles of climate change, and then developing tools and providing training to implement those tools. There was a lot of work on preparing to articulate what your development objectives are in a climate change context so they can be more successful in identifying resources. And then sharing those experiences with others. That was the wrong one. Here's some shots from the training and trainers and awareness raising workshop. Concept here is that you don't just train a couple staff, but you train staff so that they can train their colleagues and have a sustainable process. The vulnerability screening and adaptation tools that were developed really focused on the erosion, flooding, and sedimentation problem. And the tool we developed here, I'll tell you more about in the next session. Study tour of Mozambican cities. The cities of Quelimane and Beira hosted a study tour of representatives from 4 other cities where they could share lessons learned, share what cities doing resilience work outside of the CRIS program have been doing, and build a coalition of cities who are working on these issues within Mozambique. And the municipality is at the point now where they're working on an action plan for next steps. There's been a lot of change, in part catalyzed by the CRIS activity with the city. So they're now developing they now have a standing working group on climate change, and they're thinking about creating a climate change department within the municipality. They've developed this network of municipalities which didn't exist before, so they have an ongoing forum to share experience, but also to advocate for the resources that municipalities need in Mozambique. They've incorporated climate change into their municipal plan, and this is a first ever integration of climate change into their planning process. And they have plans for continuing training on climate change. The other activity that's happened is related to that vertical integration thing. So there's been improved dialogue with the national ministries in Maputo, which is a long plane ride away. And we think that that will position the municipality for more resources down the road. So there's a lot of action that's been happening. We've been making good progress in advancing climate resilience, and I will turn it over to my co-panelists to describe more about the progress they've been making. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Maria Sofia Dunin-Borkowski. I work as the local coordinator for the CRIS program in Piura, Peru. I live in Piura for the last 16 years, and I work for the GRIS program for the last year. Piura is located at the north of Peru in South America, in the purple zone. No? It's very close to equator and to the sea. No? The city isn't a coastal city, but it has a lot of influence from it. Our city, the city I live there, have 400,000 inhabitants, and since 1999, where I live, we have an average annual precipitation of 80 millimeters per year. No? Our city is growing very fast and is planified for these conditions, dry conditions. Our roofs in the buildings are straight. There's no, the streets, most of the streets are not prepared with drainage systems, and the bridges are prepared for low flow in the river. I don't know if there is a prompt. All right. When I come into Piura in 1999, and since there, so there are our conditions. No, that's the Piura I know since 99 to the present. So these are the 80 millimeters per year. But 1 year before I arrived to Piura, Piura supported 20 times this precipitation. It was like 2,000 millimeters in 1 year. No? So in 1998, we had something like 2,000 millimeters per year, but it wasn't really in a year. It was in 4 months, no? From December 1997 to April 1998, we support 2,000 millimeters. So there were the problems. The city wasn't prepared for that. Many of the neighborhoods in the city were flooded. The river level increased few inches to the platform of the bridge, and several bridges in the city fell down. No? Look for the last picture. This is the Bolognese Bridge. It fell in 1998 with other bridges. This is the new Bolognese Bridge. It has constructed after 1998. It is prepared to work in dry and wet conditions. No? The second picture is from 2002 year, where we don't have a lot of precipitation, but we have a very big flow in the river, and the bridge supported it. No? So this bridge is prepared and designed to work in wet and dry conditions. But so we have experience with our engineers in the city to design this kind of infrastructure that can give services in all conditions, but they are like separate. We we need help to make better work and make it together, no? So all these initiatives can be in a plan, in a global plan for the city. The CRIS program. So the CRIS program is working for the last 2 years in Piura with us. The CRIS program has developed many tools to assess vulnerability and to plan adaptations for the climate change in Piura. The CRIS program has trained us and the municipality team to work with these tools. And the CRIS program helped the different departments in the city, in the municipality city, to work each other between them, no? Because each department generally they are working in a separate way, as I told you before. So now we are talking between us, between departments, and we are learning about how we can, or they can apply these new tools in our work in Piura. The CRIS team also helped the municipality to work with another cities in Peru. No? They work with the city of Trujillo, and also they work in Santo Domingo in a peer learning with another persons of other countries. This is a new thing for us. On December 2014, the central government of Peru, with the help of the German and American mission in Peru, worked on a guide to make projects in the for the different cities using risk and climate change specifications. So this is a new and good deal, and we are now starting to use this in Peru. It's mandatory, so we, at every instance of the government, we have to use this guide to make the new projects in Peru. It's we are working with them, with the teams of the municipalities, of the regional governments, and they know that they have to use this guide, and they want to use it, but they are not. They don't know how to use it to front the climate change, no? So this is the perfect moment, or the perfect timing, to teach them how to include all the things that, or all the items that we learned in the past 2 years with the CRIS program, to apply it in this guidance, in this guide. No? For example, our next steps that we are working with the municipality of Piura is to work a project that is current, is in process, with this new guide. No? It's a little project, but it's the opportunity for us to introduce this climate change using the new rules and applying it and validating it for the next projects. So that are our next steps in Piura. Thank you.
Hello. I'm glad that Joanne and Maria Sofia talked about some more specifics with Mozambique and with Peru, because I'm not really going to do that with the Dominican Republic. My name is Monica Bansel. I was the Climate Change Office Director in the Dominican Republic when we first started the CRIS program there. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about the USAID perspective, our field missions perspective on this type of a program, which is to say, CRIS in the pilot cities, it was a small, relatively for USAID, a short-term pilot. So I wanted to talk about why I thought it was a success there in a time when I'm now in Washington, and I know a lot of senior leadership who will literally start a meeting off and say, I hate pilots. We don't want to do pilots. So, why this was a success given that context. So, okay. So I'm going to start off with about 30 seconds, hopefully, of context. This is the Dominican Republic. It is a relatively small country in the Caribbean, about 10 million people. You can see here that it's carved up into 32 provinces. There's a really funny poem that we get when I'm a Foreign Service officer, when we arrive in the DR from this former Peace Corps volunteer, where it compares the DR to China, and you don't know it until the end, but the DR actually, I think, has more provinces than China. Decentralization began in the 90s, like much of the world, I think, but it's still very, very underdeveloped in the DR. Like Joanne mentioned, there's a big problem with specifically in the DR between coordination between the central government and 32 local provincial governments. And then the municipalities as a whole other problem where they have very little control over city budgets. City revenues are actually still funneled to the central government and then redistributed back out to all of the cities. And city development decisions are very spread out among many different organizations. When we first started scoping for CRIS in Santo Domingo, we were trying to figure out what sector to work in, and we very quickly eliminated transportation because it was, I think it was 11 different entities that had some authority over urban transportation. It should be no surprise that it does not work in Santo Domingo at all. And of course, there are many, the typical national level constraints that virtually every country that USAID works in has: high corruption, resource constraints, poor basic service delivery. And the DR has a very high level of socioeconomic disparity. I just want to stress that it's considered a middle income country, but 40% of the population lives in poverty. So there's an opportunity here in that, maybe 2 to 3 years ago, urban planning and municipal control over urban planning really came to the forefront in that the central government began developing a national land use plan. Still a centrally managed thing, but there was a lot of discussion around municipal planning. So with that country context, just some mission context as well, some USAID context. At the time that we were discussing the CRIS project, we were already well underway in our strategic thinking for our next 5-year program. So we knew the mission itself would focus on an urban corridor, the main urban corridor of the country that connected Santo Domingo to Santiago. These are the 2 largest cities in the Dominican Republic. And that would be across our entire portfolio of health, education, democracy, and governance, and also climate change adaptation, which was one of our 3 major development objectives. For that piece, for the climate change piece, we knew we wanted to focus on slum neighborhoods in those 2 major cities of Santo Domingo and Santiago, and also to focus on 2 coastal cities that were growing to take advantage of the opportunities there. We knew we had already settled on a couple of major climate impacts in the Dominican Republic of water provision, primarily drinking water, and then also flooding impacts. And we designed a program around this that strategically blended wanting to strengthen climate information, climate change, integration of climate change into urban planning, and then supporting actual adaptation through sustainable municipal finance, through project development, this sort of thing. So we're actually at a stage right now in the mission in the DR where those three activities will begin implementation in hopefully in the next few months. So I want to just say that we entered into CRIS very deliberately to bridge us into this new project. So I'm going to just give you my punchline here is that these small amounts of pilot money I think are often seen as a waste, as one-off efforts. But I want to stress that I think if they're tied to a phased approach of sorts with larger efforts to come, they can be truly catalytic. I think they can be an opportunity to start on some of the soft issues that require little money but a lot of time, something that we often don't have a lot of patience for. For instance, I think building relationships and institutional arrangements when you have 11 different entities working on one urban issue it sounds soft, but it's critical. And I think that's really what we have to do to lay the groundwork for a much larger development program to hit the ground running in a much more focused way, which I think we can now do there. So from the USAID perspective, I think the internal sustainability with USAID, I think, was really critical, in addition to some of the local strengths that I'll talk about. So I will get into what Chris actually did. So I'll jump to that. What we decided on doing was to incorporate climate resilience into the water utility of Santo Domingo, into their new master plan for water infrastructure. We knew there were a lot of issues with water provision, particularly to the marginalized neighborhoods that we were most concerned with. A lot of them, stemming from utility commercialization, issues with high losses, lack of maintenance, to a very serious disconnect between the utilities planning and the city's planning. So the city would approve developments to places without consulting with the utility, or vice versa, and you'd have developments that did not have piped water. Virtually everyone I knew in the city did not drink water from the tap. This is an even bigger issue in slum areas where service provision is really, it's non-existent. So just to give you some photographic context of where we're working, this is some of the slum neighborhoods in Santo Domingo that are right up on the Osama River. Obviously, providing piped water to areas like this is pretty difficult, and for that reason, they depend on the river for much of their water. For drinking, they'll often, it's bottled water often, which is extremely expensive, and river water for other uses. This looks lovely, but it's not when you zoom out. So this is the Isabel River that's on the northeastern portion of the city, and these residents will use the river for bathing, for recreation, for washing. I just want to say that when Joanne and I did a river tour here, they actually pulled a dead body out of the water right around there. And I want to just make the point that that there's also an issue of resilience to infrastructure when there is infrastructure in these areas. So this is, there's a lot of untreated wastewater that just gets dumped right into the river, right where people are fishing or collecting water, et cetera. So given this context, Chris did three things. We assembled a working group of key players: the water utility, the municipality, and the National Meteorology Office. and a local NGO with decades of experience working in these barrios. Through working group discussions and presentations on the master plan, on the Dominican Republic's vulnerability to climate change, and on the city's developing urban planning process, the CRIS approach worked well to choose a focus project from the master plan that was likely to be completed, and that touched these areas that we cared about. So we settled on a couple of specific assets, such as a wastewater treatment plant that was near here. Sorry, I don't have maps. The next step was then to work with the group to analyze these assets with climate data in the CRIS sensitivity matrix and determine specific vulnerabilities and potential design changes. This is where I just want to mention one challenge that I think was actually an opportunity. We had quite a bit of trouble getting climate data, and in engaging the Met Office specifically. And we knew with our broader program that this was a really great opportunity for us to test government capacities and political will. The Met Office was going to be, and I think it still will be, a big partner of the mission going forward with our 5-year program. But this was a good test case for us to see what we really could expect from them and what we really should write into our much larger 5-year strategy. Okay, so why was this small intervention so successful? First, I should say that it was successful. There were a couple of outcomes I wanna touch on. Just that a lot of the recommendations from the group were in fact, or are in fact in the process of being incorporated by the water utility. It didn't produce a report that sat on a shelf. For instance, one of the collectors that was under construction by the utility has now been planned to be submersible after some specific flooding impacts were identified by the group. There are other examples of this that I can talk about maybe in questions if there's time. But the most important outcome I think is the continuity of the work and the internal continuity, and that it was mission-led, but also the external continuity. So we had some really great local champions, not just one, but I think using the mission to identify who those were was really useful, because our senior Dominican staff member knows the entire country and was very able to very specifically point out, well, if we have these folks from the water utility and we have Jose Miguel Martinez, who's from the municipality, working on this team, we will likely be able to bring on others. And that's exactly what they did. I mean, through his peer pressure, we got the Met Office to engage. Though it was difficult, they did still engage. In fact, we were dealing with the director of climatology at the Met Office who did not believe in climate change. And we still had them on board, I think, through this peer pressure. Because I'm supposed to end, I'm going to just really quickly jump to just that because of the group that we had, I think design changes were implemented at the utility. They've also formed an internal utility climate change group to screen new investments. I think largely that was because of who they had in the working group. They had their chief engineer participate in the working group discussions. And so when recommendations came up, there wasn't any lost in translation that had to go through the policy shop, then to the engineers, and they didn't believe or understand what was being said. They were at the table. The next step that I think is really cool is that because USAID is still involved, because the working group members are still involved, there is a lot of discussion and expanding this to the electricity utilities, to telecom, to getting public works involved, because they have identified infrastructure assets that they need to fix, or they need to incorporate resilience into, where it's public works that's in charge of it. One thing I wanted to end on that's sort of it's sort of something to think about going forward is where the utility is now. The water utility is in a position where they're now seeking funding for implementation. And I think this is a big issue that I've been thinking about and I don't have an answer to is, how do we support larger scale, utility scale adaptation in urban areas where you're not necessarily guaranteed, revenue streams, and you also, in the DR, we had a huge problem with municipalities not having the authority to issue bonds or not having, or not being creditworthy enough to issue bonds, these sort of things. So how do we actually implement the bigger stuff going forward? I will end there, sorry, I went over. Thank you very much.
So Sierra will be our last speaker, and then we'll have time for questions before our break. Each presentation raises a jillion questions, so we're going to be time constrained all day, I'm confident. Sierra.
Got it. Hi, my name is Sierra Bainbridge, and I'm with Mass Design Group. I think we're a bit of an outlier today. We aren't part of the current contract, and we're on the implementation side. But I'm hoping that you'll find what I'm going to present interesting, because it seems like, especially from what I heard on Monday and yesterday, there's a huge momentum towards implementation. That's really the next step. And so hopefully some of what we've found and a lot of our lessons learned are really, over the work that we've done in the past 5 years, are super aligned with everything that I've heard being spoken about in the last few days, and really the main kind of underlying thrust of the framework that you all have put together. Obviously, engaging community in both design and construction is something that is essential for the work that we're doing. And that includes finding the right partners and having those people as a part of the process from the very start of the design process. Relying on natural building systems. For us, this is something that we've learned through our work in Rwanda, Haiti, and Liberia, and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But we're also bringing back to the United States as we're looking for how to have resilience here in our healthcare systems and other building systems. Also contextually responsive. Something that works in the northern part of a very small country, which is Rwanda, doesn't work in central Rwanda or southern Rwanda. It's not the same from an urban area to a rural area. So it's very hard to have a one-size-fits-all solution, which is what we're often confronted with when we're working with local governments. I'm just going to jump into the projects and illustrate as we're going how those pieces come out. This was our first project, and it is in a rural area, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit because, again, it's a place where we really learned everything about how we work now. This is in northern Rwanda. It's a hospital, a 200-bed hospital situated on the top of a hill in a region that has 400,000 people, and at the time when Paul Farmer and Partners in Health were invited by Paul Kagame to come and work here, had no doctors. So the question was, how can we get a hospital that is accessible to everyone? It's at the top of a hill, which allowed us to take full advantage of natural systems. So we really relied on redundant and natural systems to have infection control. That was our main driving feature. And all of our solutions are really, really simple. Here we have a fan that pulls air up into this upper plenum, and then UVGI treatment, which uses light to treat air so that any kind of atomized germs are cleaned. And that works when the electricity's on, but what if the electricity isn't on, which happens on a daily basis there? We have natural cross ventilation with built-in permanent louvers and windows on all sides of this 40 or 50 bed ward. And so that will ensure the minimum number of air changes per hour as a guideline from the WHO, even when the electricity is not on. And another core issue of infection control is circulation. A lot of times you're waiting in hallways for your consultation, or you're moving through hallways to get to other places. And so why have the hallways in the wards or inside of the building in places where you have just amazing climate? We moved all of the circulation to the exterior of the buildings. All the waiting areas are on the exterior of the buildings. And most people like to spend time there anyway, and so that really reduces this potential for cross-infection. And this is an example of that. Obviously, a really nice outdoor waiting area. But this slide also, to me, reminds us of how we worked with the local communities. Again, we started with being invited by Paul Farmer to work with Partners in Health. And we were there for a year of immersion to understand how this hospital needed to work. Obviously, Western healthcare delivery models are not adequate. It's a totally different situation. There's a lot of brain drain. There just isn't enough staff, which is how you end up with large wards. How can we make large wards really comfortable and yet have good infection control? So that meant working with clinicians, working with end users, the patients, working with local government, and working with the Ministry of Health throughout the entire process and from the beginning. And a year of immersion is quite a long time for a design project, but healthcare and hospitals are very complex systems. And then, as we moved into construction, also working with the local community. You could do all of the earthworks on this site for the same price with a bulldozer as employing 1,000 people. So we, in the end, overall employed 4,000 people. We had a rotating labor system, which allowed us to inject a lot of that funding back into the community. But for me, its importance to resilience is that you're using local materials and you're using local labor, which means if there is an emergency or disaster event, they know how to fix this place and the materials are right there. You don't have to wait for them to come in to be imported from another place. And you have the people and the labor that have built it before and understand how to build it again. And then, working with Paul Farmer, he's a big proponent of landscape. There is this idea that if you just build the building to house the service, that's enough. But you need to have a place that is beautiful and looks like it's well taken care of. That goes a long way to ensure that people feel comfortable and confident that they're going to get care that's going to heal them. And especially in these rural areas where people will often prefer to go to a local healer, if they're not familiar with the hospital, they're not going to go there until it's a last resort, and oftentimes it's too late. We heard many stories while we were on site of people just coming when it was just far too late for them to be helped. So that is a huge advantage of having the local community be a part of this building process. 4,000 people and all of their family and all of their villages, people were coming often from a long, far away, now are familiar with this place and much more likely to use it and have a comfort level that they would not have had before. And then I'm going to move quickly from that. There were a number of other projects. Whoops. This is the first rural cancer treatment center in Butaro. It's on the same campus, but using, again, some of the same aspects of design, water collection through this inverted roof, using these color strips, have all ventilation on the top, and then these huge floor-to-ceiling windows that are on a pivot. And all of these are made locally. We have, the people who made these doors have worked on almost all of our projects in Rwanda. We found them on our second project, actually. But this is allowing for not only a beautiful space for people to be healed in as they're sitting and getting infusions for 6 hours or more, but also just great cross ventilation and natural lighting, so everything can continue to happen even if there is an electricity outage, which is nearly every day. Same thing in this Nanzi maternity ward, which is, now we're moving now into a slightly more urban area. This is a small emerging city in Rwanda, not the capital city, but another. And this is a ventilation chimney. So the idea here is that because the buildings around are a bit higher and we're not on top of a hill, we can't really rely on natural breezes coming through at the level of the building. So we had to pop these chimneys up. They're also made out of local basalt, which is very dark and very heavy, so it absorbs heat throughout the day. And all of this pulls air up and through this chimney, and again, maintaining the minimum number of air changes per hour. And then within the mass of this, we also have located the cisterns so that, again, you have always gravity-fed water, at least for a few days until those cisterns are empty, and then you'd have to turn on the generators and refill them. Now we have a very urban site. This is Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and now we're looking at a multi-story building. This has all the same aspects. I think in this one we also included solar, but natural lighting, natural ventilation. And here we will have elevators that will function when the electricity is working, but if you look on the back side of this building, these are all ramps, which serve a double function, not only as an ability to access all floors at all times, but also there are beautiful outdoor areas for families and patients to spend time when they're not having treatment. Another is a tuberculosis hospital. This actually is a replacement for one that was there prior to the earthquake, and using this upper plenum to pull air up and through all of the patient treatment rooms. This is an MDR TB building where patients will live for a long time, and we also worked in the floor plan to ensure that people cleaning the rooms and the doctors would not become sick through being there. This is moving to Liberia now. this is a Ebola treatment center, and obviously Ebola is not directly related to a climate change emergency, but it is a result of some of the same things that you guys are dealing with. There's an absolute lack of infrastructure in Liberia, hospitals, sanitation networks, all of these things. One of these units cost $5.7 million to build and run for 6 months. The hospital that we built in Rwanda was $1 million less than this. And so from our perspective, the more that we can do to ensure that these countries have strong and resilient infrastructure from the start prior to all of these emergencies and climate resistant infrastructure, climate change resistant, the better off we're going to be when those disasters hit. And again, to do this is at the policy level, but we visited every health center in the country as part of the process of putting together the national standards and guidelines, and we're engaged with the local government and all of the players from each of those health centers to try to figure out what can a standard look like, even though it's as thick as it is, how can we make something that people can actually access? Because the worst situation happens all the time, and this is the same with buildings. If it's not built and locally engaged at the time that you're producing it, people are not going to be able to understand how to use it. And then finally, I'm just going to take 2 minutes to talk about cholera in Haiti, which is directly related to, again, a lack of infrastructure. But I think what we try to do is work with Jeshkio, another local team member, who has a huge healthcare campus right next to Cité Soleil, which is an informal settlement there, to understand maybe there's some solutions for infrastructure that are not as familiar as we are, some of the things that you're talking about, that some of the solutions that we have and we've been using in the West for hundreds of years may not be appropriate for the future that we're facing. After the earthquake in 2010, following in that year, obviously cholera just kind of erupted. But it's not just Haiti. This was an extreme example where 8,000 people died within the year. But cholera is on the rise in many countries, and if you look at the places where it's red, it's especially in places where infrastructure is not functioning. And in fact, 40% of the world's population has no access to modern sanitation. I think none of these figures are new for all of you, and I'm sure you've all seen this in the places where you're working, Brazil, India, and others. But not only in cholera, but there are continuing diseases that are kind of considered as a constant. Diarrheal diseases kill, it's the second leading cause of death in children under 5. So just in 1 minute, our solution here was the cholera treatment center, which is, instead of building these tents, which cost a lot of money, they're replaced every 6 months, they're not a long-term solution. If you can take that money and have something that's fast and locally built, and also is multi-use, so that when perhaps that cholera epidemic ends, it still has use and utility beyond that, and have it as a pointal system. So in this building, we collect water from the roof that is used for the cleaning of all the waste materials from the cholera patients. All of that water goes into this treatment, which guarantees 99.97% of all germs are removed, so we're not having this issue of recontamination, which was the biggest problem during the cholera outbreak. And then it's reinfiltrated into the ground. So what you have is a self-contained system for a non-contaminating cholera treatment center or diarrheal disease treatment center. And again, it's built all of local materials. All of these screens, which are for ventilation and light and privacy of the patients, are based on the local metalworker craft that you see if you go to Haiti. If any of you have been, you've seen it. And we worked with them to develop this system, which is the kind of sheathing system of the building. And so again, you have the same result. If it's something that's built there and can be maintained there, it can be guaranteed to have a lot longer life cycle. But also looking, if one is great and can treat this area, what if you started to disperse these throughout? And so rather than having kind of an underground sanitation network system that we're all familiar with, which is never going to happen here, there just isn't the funding, and it's this very low-lying area that soon will be kind of subject to inundation. Why not have pointal centers that also can provide clean water? Jeshkio is already in the business of providing tablets and water to local communities that they can treat themselves. And you have a place to use the restrooms, because almost everyone in these areas use publicly provided restrooms. And if you can do it in that, then why not do it in multiple places? And they're also so light and less expensive. When the inundation starts to happen, you can either kind of take bits and pieces of this and relocate it on higher ground, or it's not as massive a loss as large-scale infrastructure. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I spent this Monday touring rural tuberculosis treatment facilities in Ukraine. They need your help. I'm not sure if the cross-ventilation is going to be the answer in their winter. Thank you to all of our speakers for keeping us on schedule. It leaves us some time for some questions. I have a lot of my own questions, but that's not my role today. We have microphones in the room someplace. Why don't you come up to the middle of the room here so you can, we'll take a question here. I'll take 2 questions and then we'll get some answers and then we'll come back. If you could keep your questions to questions so everybody has a chance. I'm starting over here if we can. Great.
Thanks.
Please introduce yourself. And
Alex Guerra from the Climate Change Research Institute in Guatemala. In the last presentation, you mentioned a little bit about rainwater harvesting. And I'd like to ask the other speakers also on the potential of rainwater harvesting as one of the options for water provision in cities. Perhaps in Piura, I don't know, 80 millimeters a year is very, very little, but I'm wondering about the potential for urban areas.
great. Let me collect another question before and we'll try to move faster that way. Up here on the left.
Hi, Mark Robinson, World Resources Institute. Thanks for the presentations. Hugely varied, interesting case studies. What is the science driving the underlying analysis of why it's so critical for the case studies you selected? I saw some evidence of intermittent weather changes in some years, but I wasn't sure what was driving the intensity of the responses that you outlined. So why were these selected? Was it because there is great evidence showing that these particular cities are at really high risk, or is it simply they were just selected as good cases of vulnerability? And the second question is really about sustainability of the adaptation responses. I was really interested to hear Joanne's description of these really important joining up between different jurisdictions and cities and building in long-term response capacity. What's going to create the basis for sustainability of those new institutional structures you've helped create?
These are good questions. Let's get some responses to that, to either of those, as you volunteer, and then we'll go ahead. On rainwater harvesting or issues of sustainability and the underlying science. Monica?
I can just say something quickly on the rainwater harvesting. It wasn't something that we talked about specifically in the Dominican Republic, but I can say that more broadly, I think that it's something that has been almost common in the way USAID approaches some of the construction work that we do. So, for instance, in building permanent settlements in Haiti, this was a common feature of the housing units that we were putting in. So like cisterns for rainwater collection, and not necessarily. So this would be use for washing and this sort of thing. So these were, I don't know, one settlement of maybe 1,500 houses where we did that for every single house. It is something that we talked about, that we thought more broadly about in the Dominican Republic, because obviously there's, I think there is a lot of potential for it, especially in slum communities where they don't have water provision and they are getting it from a very polluted river. But it's not something that we've implemented yet.
On the harder question, if the bridge had not fallen in Peru, how would they have focused on bridges, I guess, is a specific way of asking the broader question of the political sustainability. But Joanne, you seem to have an answer or a framework anyway prepared.
Yeah, actually, I was going to talk about the water demand.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay.
And on that point, I think it's very relevant, that whole concept is very relevant to Piura and the whole northern coastal plain in Peru because it's a desert. It's getting warmer. They have severe drought as well as extreme precipitation, and the demand for water is going up as commercial agriculture expands. And so some of the work in the region that they're looking at is capturing water upstream in the Piura River in large polders so that they can have more demand management of the water resources, and also protect the downstream urban areas during the extreme water events. So you hit the nail on the head there with the need for more watershed level systems management of water issues.
Can you address also this, how do you pick the pilot city?
Yeah, so I would say that the demand for responding to climate change is no greater, no less in the pilot cities that we selected than it is in many developing cities around the world. Our criteria for selecting them were that they be growing rapidly in second-tier cities rather than mega cities, because we were looking at those cities that were on the growing rapidly and probably lower capacity than your Limas or Bangkoks or that sort of thing. And that there was interest of the USAID mission in country in the work that we would attempt to do, that the city had the capacity to take on being a pilot, because they needed to have interest in participating and being willing to give their staff the time to work on that issue. The climate science, so the issue was, how do they collect both the historic climate data and the projections that are available to them and integrate that into their existing decision-making processes. So we tried to avoid setting up separate institutions, but rather give them tools to incorporate the climate information into the decisions that they routinely make. And we hope that supports a sustainable system.
I think your question identifies the implementation challenge. We've got pilots we know work, but the issue is how to embed those in indigenous systems. We've got time for a couple of other quick questions.
I have a question from online, if I could jump in there.
Okay, online quickly, and then I'll go to
Okay.
the front of the room here.
Kimberly Frank from the law firm McCarter and English in Washington, D.C. has a question specifically for Ms. Bainbridge. She asks if solar solar PV systems, I'm sorry, I'm looking for it, would improve electric reliability for the hospitals.
Can you give a quick answer to that, and I can go to my last question here
Sure,
before
I
the
can
break?
give a very quick answer. It would, and what is lacking at the moment are reliable systems for solar. We have tried to have all of our clients look at solar on every project, and working as much as we have with PIH, they have been given solar systems, solar electric collection systems, and they failed within a year because you need to have the right maintenance and the right people to support them over a long term. And what's happening now, and probably maybe more successful, is some groups are getting together and offering packages where you get the solar system, the panels, the batteries, and the maintenance program for a long term upfront, and you can kind of even pay on a monthly rather than, and the other big challenge is getting them to invest in this upfront cost, especially when the budgets are just so strapped. So yes, we would love to have solar, but we've just not been able to convince anyone to use it.
Okay, one last question, then it's time for our break. Sir.
All right, first a comment, then a question. One, if
You are?
you're looking at large-scale distributed rainwater collection, you could get unintended consequences in terms of disease with things like increased dengue from vector-borne diseases that breed in there. They're seeing this in Sao Paulo. But the question I had for Sierra was, you stressed the importance of including the local talent, skills in constructing these hospitals and maintaining them. Were the traditional healers brought into this network as part of the health solution?
In our process and where we were working, they were not. Partially because they were not, in the area that we were working, they weren't quite local to that town. They were a couple of hours away. There were a number of trips out to those areas, and we certainly spoke with people, but they weren't necessarily with us on a daily basis. But we did, through the clinicians that have worked there for a much longer term and who work with them on a daily basis in the health centers. So there's a system in the government that's taken up by the government now, which is started by PIH, which is about community healthcare workers, and they work with the hospital, but then go out to the local communities. And they gathered information for us and took our designs and thoughts back to those communities to get feedback. But I wasn't there actually for a good portion of that first year, and I don't, from what I know, they weren't actually with us together. But we've been doing other work in Lesotho since, and we've always gone to an effort to include local healers in our more recent projects. It's a great question, though.
Thank you. We're out of time for this session. There's a bunch of other questions I have, and I suspect you as well. But feel free to accost our speakers during the break and afterwards. A lot of interesting information here. I have to say that the most distressing information I've heard is that there's antipathy toward pilots, antipathy toward looking before we leap at the agency that funds so much good work in this area. We're going to break for 10 minutes and reconvene at 10:30. And during that time, the coffee's at the back of the hallway, as you know, and I'll ask our second panel to come up. But before we do that, join me in thanking our panel.